The Pokemon world has never been quite as simple as it first appeared, and the longer you look at it, the more questions begin to gather in the quiet places between the known and the unknown. There are things tucked into the margins of every game, details that seem too deliberate to be accidents, locations that carry just a little too much atmosphere to be mere decoration, and legends that refuse to fully resolve themselves even after you have read every line of dialogue and turned over every stone. These are the unsolved mysteries of the Pokemon world, the questions that have lingered across generations of players, passed from one conversation to the next like something half remembered from a dream. And before we drift any further, please subscribe to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Some of these mysteries have answers that are incomplete. Some have answers that feel like they raise even more questions, and some have no satisfying resolution at all, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about them. What follows is an attempt to sit with those questions gently, to turn them over in the low light of a late evening, and to let the wondering itself become something restful. The first mystery worth considering is not dramatic in the way that some of them will be. It does not involve ancient gods or apocalyptic powers or creatures from beyond the edges of the known universe. It is quieter than that, and quieter things have a way of staying with you longer. In the earliest Pokemon games, the world felt like a real place, in a way that is sometimes difficult to describe. There were towns with names and histories, routes that felt like they connected logically to one another, and details scattered throughout the environment that suggested a life existing just beyond the edges of the screen. One of those details was a single truck sitting motionless beside the dock in Vermilion City, impossible to reach under normal gameplay conditions, tucked behind a barrier that served no obvious purpose. The truck was not interactive. It held nothing. It had no hidden compartment that could be opened, no shadow beneath it that concealed a rare encounter, nothing that would justify the resources that went into placing it there as a unique sprite found nowhere else in the entire game. And yet it was preserved. It appeared in the remakes years later. A lava cookie, a local specialty from an entirely different region, could be found near it. These details accumulated around something that was officially nothing at all. What makes the Vermilion truck interesting is not what it contains, but what it represents. The effort required to create a unique graphic, to place it in the one location players could not easily access, and then to carry that detail forward into multiple versions of. The game across years of development suggests that it meant something to someone, whether that meaning was a private joke, an unfinished plan, or a deliberate invitation to wonder. It left behind a feeling that the world had more to it than players were allowed to see. The ship that docked at that port carries its own quiet mystery, one that is easy to miss because it arrives wrapped in ordinary dialogue. A sailor explains that the vessel will be gone for approximately a year before returning. The game presents this as a simple piece of world building, a way of making the port feel like a real port, where ships actually go places and come back. But the ship never returns. The dock where it once sat remains empty through the entire duration of the game and into the events of the sequel. There is a technical explanation for this. The original games had no internal clock capable of measuring the passage of a year, so the ship's promised return could never actually be scripted to occur. But that explanation, while accurate, does not quite account for why the writers chose to specify a year at all, or why the sequel placed an entirely different ship at that same dock without any acknowledgement of what happened to the original one. The absence of the original ship in the sequel feels deliberate in a way that its absence in the original game does not. The sequel was careful to reconstruct the first game's region with considerable attention to nostalgia, bringing back familiar locations and familiar faces in ways that felt like a reunion. The decision to replace the ship rather than return it introduced a small but noticeable gap in the continuity, a question mark placed quietly where an answer should have been. Perhaps the ship returned at some point between the two games and then departed again, its story playing out in the gap between cartridges where no player could observe it. Perhaps it did not return at all, and the sequel's silence on the matter was its way of acknowledging that some things in the world simply disappear without explanation. The melody that plays on the original ship is one of the gentler pieces of music in the game, and there is something in its tone that matches the feeling of a departure that was, never followed by a return. Lavender Town sits at the eastern edge of the first region, like a place that has always been there and will continue to be there long after everything else has changed. Its original purpose was to serve as a resting place, a location where the spirits of Pokémon were honored and where players first encountered the concept of death made explicit. Within the game's world, the tower at its center was built for that purpose and filled with the graves of Pokémon who had passed, tended by a man named Fuji who had dedicated his later life to their care. What the sequel revealed was that the tower had been demolished. In its place, a radio tower had been constructed, and the tombstones that had once filled the original tower's floors were said to have been relocated to a smaller graveyard. Nearby, Mr. Fuji remained, tending to this new, reduced space, and within the dialogue of the sequel, there was a mention of secret chambers beneath the graveyard, chambers accessible only to Mr. Fuji himself, which no player was ever shown. The chambers could be interpreted practically. A graveyard large enough to receive all the remains from a tower of that height would need considerably more space than the surface area of a small memorial garden, and underground storage for tombstones would be a reasonable architectural solution, but the phrasing of the dialogue suggests something more guarded than a storage space. The word secret carries weight in a location already defined by its relationship to the unseen and the unreachable. What Mr. Fuji keeps below the surface of that quiet garden is a question the games have never answered. He is a character defined by devotion, a scientist who abandoned research to dedicate himself to the welfare of abandoned Pokémon, and a man who had personally witnessed the horrors that grief and obsession could produce. Whatever lies beneath that graveyard, he has chosen to protect it rather than share it, and the games have honored that choice with silence. The upper floors of the radio tower that replace the old tower present a different kind of mystery, one that is less emotionally resonant but no less curious. Several floors of the building are inaccessible to the player without any narrative justification for why this should be. The tower operates, broadcasts, and serves as a central location in the sequel's plot, but its highest rooms remain sealed off behind barriers that are never explained. The practical answer involves the limitations of the cartridge that contained the sequel. Including the original region alongside the new one was already a significant technical accomplishment, and some locations had to be compressed or left incomplete to make the technology function at all. Closed floors in a radio tower were a simple solution to a storage problem, dressed in the narrative clothing of restricted access, but the feeling of something unfinished in those upper floors has lingered. There is a version of the sequel where something meaningful happens at the top of the tower, some discovery or confrontation or quiet revelation that would have made the climb worth undertaking. That version was never made, and what remains is a building that is taller than the story it contains, with floors that go nowhere and doors that stay closed for reasons the game does not bother to provide. The connection between the two regions that were joined in the second game contains its own mysteries, particularly around the question of how far apart they actually are and how long it takes to travel between them. The games depict this journey as a relatively brief sailing trip, the kind that might take an afternoon, and yet the geography of the world as it has been presented in various forms suggests that the distance should be considerably greater. This is not necessarily a contradiction that demands resolution. The Pokémon world has always operated according to its own internal logic, with distances compressed and expanded to serve the needs of the story and the gameplay, and the maps that players navigate are understood to be representations rather than precise cartographic documents. But the question of how these two regions fit together geographically has never been fully resolved, and the glimpses of a wider world beyond both of them suggest that there is considerably more landmass than any single game has been willing to show. The southeast of the second game's region, in particular, seems to gesture towards something, routes that end at ocean borders without any clear destination, water stretching off into the edge of the map with no indication of what lies beyond it. The world feels large in those moments, larger than any single adventure can contain, and the mysteries that live at the edges of the known map are among the most enduring. Because they are mysteries of pure geography, of places that might exist but have never been visited. There is a building in the middle of the first region that has been the subject of quiet speculation since the earliest days of the franchise. It sits in the game's second largest city, its upper floors sealed off and accessible only through a key card system that restricts entry to the few floors that serve the game's narrative purposes. The corporation that occupies it is enormous, its reach extending into almost every aspect of the region's infrastructure, and yet the sheer volume of office space it appears to contain seems to exceed any reasonable corporate need. The blocked elevator is the detail that stays with players. It is there, functional in appearance, present in the world, and yet the floors it accesses above a certain point are simply not accessible. The game never explains what is stored on those floors, what work is being done there, or why a player with full permission to be in the building is nevertheless restricted from going all the way up. It is one of those details that functions as a kind of formal invitation, a door that is visibly present and visibly closed. The corporation's activities in the first region's games include a range of projects, some of them ethically troubling, and the sealed floors of their headquarters have become a kind of symbolic container for everything that the organization might have been doing that the games were not quite ready to show. Whatever was being researched on those upper floors, whatever decisions were being made in those restricted boardrooms, the building keeps its secrets with a completeness that the games have never bothered to violate. One of the quieter mysteries of the first region involves a small house on a residential street in the largest city, occupied by a man who identifies himself as the owner of the region's most famous fighting location. He lives alone, his manner is melancholy, he refers to his son repeatedly, a son who is not present, a son whose fate is never explicitly stated, but whose absence carries a weight that the surrounding dialogue does not quite explain. Players have long theorized about what happened to this man's son. The absence is too carefully written to be an accident, and the emotional register of the conversation suggests a grief that goes deeper than a simple family estrangement. Some theories locate the son in the rival character of the games, drawing connections between temperament and absence that the narrative never confirms. Others suggest the son is present in the game world under a different name, living a different life, the connection severed deliberately. The game does not say. It presents a grieving father in an empty house and moves on. The restraint of that narrative choice is, in its own way, one of the most affecting things in a game that is ostensibly about collecting creatures, and it sits in the memory of everyone who encountered it as a reminder that the Pokémon world has always been willing to hold more sadness than its bright colors might suggest. The second generation of games introduced a mechanic that had never been present in the first time. The world moved according to a real internal clock, and the passage of hours and days affected what the player could find and what events could occur. This was a meaningful addition because it made the world feel continuous in a way that static games cannot, and it created the conditions for a mystery that has never been fully resolved. The internal clock of the second generation could be corrupted. Through specific actions involving the game's battery-saving mechanics, players could manipulate the time in ways that affected which events were available to them, and some of these manipulations had strange effects on the game's world. There were moments where the clock seemed to behave in ways that the designers had not fully anticipated, where the passage of time created conditions that the narrative framework of the game could not cleanly absorb. What is interesting about this is not the specific glitch, but what it revealed about the relationship between time and story in the game's design. The second generation was built around the idea of a world that moved forward, that changed and grew and remembered its own past. The corruption of the clock was a corruption of that premise and the way the game's world responded to it, continuing to function in spite of the broken foundation beneath it. had the quality of something that had been designed to endure even the disruption of the very mechanism that made it feel alive. The legendary beasts that roam the second generation's region carry a history that is told partly in the game and partly in the silence between the game's words. 3 Pokémon were said to have died in a fire that destroyed an ancient tower, and a great creature came afterward and breathed new life into them, creating something that had not existed before. The 3 who emerged from that resurrection were not the same creatures they had been. They were something new, and the game marks their newness by making them almost impossible to approach. They flee every encounter. They do not hold still long enough to be understood. They move through the region continuously, appearing on routes at random, impossible to pin down through ordinary methods. This behavior has been explained within the game's fiction as wildness or wariness, the instinct of creatures that have been through something they do not have the language to describe. But the quality of their evasiveness goes beyond what the narrative explanation fully accounts for. There is something in the movement of the legendary beasts that feels like a refusal. They were brought back from death and given power they did not ask for, and now they run, not away from any specific threat, but away from everything, from all contact, from all stillness. The player who finally catches one of them does so through persistence, through cornering, through the application of patience and mechanics against a creature that would prefer not to be caught. What that encounter means, what it says about the nature of the beasts and the nature of the player's ambition, is something the game leaves entirely open. The tower where the legendary beasts died and were resurrected stands at the northern edge of the second region's largest city, and its counterpart tower to the south is considered the holier of the two. But the northern tower carries its own quiet significance. The fire that destroyed it was said to have been started by lightning, and the rain that came afterward was said to have lasted for a very long time. The floors of the original tower are still charred. The marks of the fire have not faded in the centuries since the event occurred. This detail, the persistence of the scorch marks across what the game implies are hundreds of years, has generated considerable interest. The game presents it as a consequence of the fire's supernatural origin, the lightning that started it being no ordinary lightning. But the preservation of those marks across so much time suggests that the tower itself remembers what happened there, that the physical fabric of the building is inscribed with the event in a way that cannot be removed or repainted. The bells in both towers have their own significance. The clear bell and the rainbow-colored one are objects of considerable ritual importance in the region, and the songs they produce together are said to summon the legendary creature that performed the resurrection in the first place. What is less often discussed is the question of why summoning that creature requires both bells, why the sound of one alone is insufficient, and what the difference is between the music they make separately and the music they make together. The radio tower at the center of the second game's largest city was taken over at a critical point in the story, and the events surrounding that occupation touched on questions about communication, authority, and the relationship between the present and the past that the game never fully developed. What the occupation wanted, at its deepest level, was a message. It wanted to send a signal that could reach across time and distance to a specific recipient who might or might not still be listening. Whether that message was ever received is a question the game addresses only obliquely. The recipient's absence from the sequel is one of the more discussed silences in the franchise, a gap in the narrative that players have interpreted in almost as many ways as. There are players to think about it. He left. Where he went, the game does not fully say. What he found when he got there, if he found anything at all, is entirely unresolved. The theme of communication across absence runs through the second generation in ways that are not always obvious. The messages left in the ruins of the first region's corporate headquarters, the journals found in the rocket hideout, the broadcasts that sometimes carry strange content, all of. These are examples of the game using communication as a way of marking the presence of something that is no longer present, the echo of a voice that has moved on from the place where it once spoke. One of the longest standing questions in the franchise involves the origins of the creature that is described as the genetic Pokémon, the one created through years of research, with the DNA of a mythical being as its starting material. What is known is that a laboratory was established, that experiments were conducted, and that what emerged from those experiments was something that did not accept the circumstances of its creation with equanimity. The result was catastrophic. What is less clearly established is what happened in the full sequence of events leading up to the catastrophe. The journals found in the ruins of the laboratory describe a process of creation that involved considerable suffering, both for the subject of the experiments and for the researchers who carried them out. But the journals are incomplete. Entries are missing. The record of what happened in the final stages of the project exists only in fragments, and the fragments do not add up to a complete picture. The creature itself has been presented in different ways across different versions of its story, and the contradictions between those versions are not small ones. The events surrounding its creation, the nature of its grief and its anger, and its eventual strange peace with the circumstances of its existence have been told with enough variation that no single account can be considered definitive. This is either a continuity problem or a deliberate choice, and given the thoughtfulness that has characterized other narrative decisions in the franchise, the second possibility seems worth taking seriously. The ancient ruins found in certain corners of the third generation's region contain a script that the game's characters cannot fully read. The ruins themselves are layered, built over earlier structures in ways that suggest a civilization rebuilding on top of its own history repeatedly, each layer containing a partial record of what came before. The script that covers the walls of the deepest chambers was written by someone who understood the creatures that would later be called legendary, who had observed them directly, and who wanted to preserve that knowledge for people who would come after. But the preservation was imperfect. The script was not taught to the generation that followed, and then to the generation after that, until the knowledge of how to read it was lost. What remains is a record without a reader, a message from people who understood something important about the fundamental nature of the world, inscribed in a language that no living person can fully interpret. The researchers in the game who study these ruins have made partial progress. They can identify certain patterns, certain recurring symbols, certain structures that appear to describe relationships between the creatures depicted on the walls. But the full meaning of what is written there has not been recovered, and the game's narrative seems to suggest that recovering it fully might not be possible, that some knowledge, once lost, does not come back in the same form. The weather phenomena of the third generation's region are more dramatic than almost anything found in the regions that came before. Storms that intensify to catastrophic levels, droughts that crack the earth of entire roots, the kind of environmental violence that would reshape a landscape if sustained for any significant length of time. These phenomena are connected to the legendary creatures of the region in ways that the game makes explicit, but the history of those connections, the question of how and why the weather became tied to the wills of these specific creatures, is something the game only partially addresses. There is an ancient conflict implied in the lore, a struggle between opposing forces that shape the region's geology and ecology over vast periods of time, and the interference of human technology in that conflict is presented as having consequences that extend far beyond what the technology's creators anticipated. The seafloor itself shows evidence of events that changed it permanently, structures below the water's surface that tell a story of a world that was once configured very differently than the world the games depict. What the region looked like before the ancient conflict, what the relationship between the opposing forces was before it became a conflict, and whether the resolution the games offer is a genuine resolution or simply a pause in something much longer, are all questions that sit beneath the surface of the story without fully emerging into the narrative. The world of the third generation feels more geologically active, more recently shaped by forces that are still present than the regions that preceded it, and that quality of Barely settled history gives its mysteries a particular texture. The caves of the third generation contain a creature that should not, by any logic the game provides, be findable where it is found. It lives at the lowest accessible level of a cave system of considerable depth in an environment of near total darkness, beside a pool of water that has no observable source. It is not connected to any of the major legendary narratives of the region. It does not appear in the main story. It is simply there, waiting in the dark, as if it has always been there and will continue to be there long after the player has moved on. The creature was placed there without explanation by the game's designers, and the decision to include it without context has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as a reward for exploration, a discovery waiting for the player who went deeper than the story required. Others see it as a remnant of an earlier narrative plan, something that was supposed to connect to a story that was ultimately not told. The most interesting interpretation is the simplest one, that the world contains things that are not explained by the story, creatures living in places the story never visits, existing quietly in the gaps between the events that the narrative considers important. The relationship between the third generation's antagonist organizations and the ecological balance of the region they inhabit is one of the more thematically rich aspects of that generation's story. One organization sought to expand the sea, the other sought to expand the land. Both were operating from a position of genuine belief that what they wanted was correct, and the game presents this symmetry with enough care that neither position is entirely dismissed. But what the game does not resolve is the question of what the world would look like if either organization had fully succeeded. The creatures they attempted to awaken were not simply powerful entities to be deployed as weapons. They were foundational forces tied to the structure of the region and possibly to the structure of the world itself. What expanding the sea to its maximum extent or contracting it to its minimum would have done to the living systems that depended on the current balance is a question the game raises and then moves past. The aftermath of the game's events, the world restored to its previous state with the awakened creatures returned to their resting places, feels like a return to normal in ways. That may be incomplete. Systems that have been disrupted, even briefly, do not always recover to exactly the state they were in before. The ecological consequences of what happened, the effects on the creatures and the humans who live in the region, are not shown. The game ends with restoration, but what restoration cost and whether it was fully achieved is left to the imagination. There is a tower in the third generation's region that is described as the tallest in the world, and the floors near its top contain a Pokémon that cannot be found anywhere else in the game. The creature was placed there without fanfare, high enough above the ground that reaching it requires considerable effort, and its appearance at the top of the world's tallest structure carries a symbolic weight that the game allows players to interpret without guidance. It is a creature associated with the sky and with the endless spaces above the clouds, and the game positions it at the highest point accessible to any player as if to suggest that some things can only be found by going as far up as the world allows. What it is doing there, what it is waiting for, or whether it is waiting for anything at all, the game does not say. It is simply present at the summit, in the place where height runs out, occupying the highest room of the tallest building in the world with a quiet that feels almost deliberate. The tower itself has a history that the game references in fragments. It was built for a purpose that is never entirely clear by people whose motivations the game gestures toward without fully explaining. The view from the top floors, if it were depicted, would show the entire region spread out below, but the game is not concerned with the view. It is concerned with what is waiting at the top, and in letting that thing be found without ceremony, it makes the discovery feel like a personal encounter rather than a narrative event. The fourth generation introduced a mythology of creation so comprehensive that it changed the way every earlier game in the franchise could be read. The being that shaped the world from an empty void, the late guardians who gave living things their capacity for emotion and knowledge and will, the temporal and spatial entities. whose domains divided the fundamental structure of existence. These were not additions to an existing cosmology, but the revelation that a cosmology had existed all along. What this revelation did to the stories that preceded it was complex. Characters and events from earlier games acquired new significance when viewed through the lens of a universe with an explicit origin story. The relationships between legendary creatures from different regions could now be considered in terms of where they fit within a hierarchy of creation that spanned the entire world. But the mythology also raised questions that it did not resolve, and the most persistent of those questions involves the relationship between the being who shaped the world and the being described as the antimatter entity. The antimatter creature was not created in the same moment or through the same process as everything else. It came into being as a consequence of the creative act, as if the universe required its opposite in order to maintain whatever balance makes existence possible. The relationship between these two entities, one that brought everything into being and one whose existence is defined by an opposition to being, is the central unanswered question of the fourth generation's mythology, and every narrative involving either of them circles around the nature of that relationship without fully landing on an answer. The lakes of the fourth generation's region are each occupied by a small creature who governs an aspect of consciousness. One presides over knowledge, one over emotion, one over willpower. They are small, each of them, smaller than you might expect for beings responsible for something so fundamental, and they hide in the depths of their lakes with a wariness that seems disproportionate to their apparent power. What the game explains is that they gave their gifts to human beings at some point in the distant past, and that the consequences of those gifts shaped the course of human history in the region. What the game does not explain is what human beings were like before they received those gifts, what consciousness was like without the capacity for knowledge, or emotion, or will fully integrated into it, and whether the beings who gave those gifts understood what they were doing, or whether the gifts had unintended consequences that are still playing out. The three lake guardians are related to a fourth being of greater power, one who existed before them and shaped the fundamental nature of mind itself. The relationship between the three and the one, between the partial expressions of consciousness and the complete form of it, is something the game's mythology describes, but does not illuminate. There is a sense that the three lake guardians are aspects of something larger, separated manifestations of a unity that was divided for reasons the mythology does not explain. The distortion world that the fourth generation introduces is perhaps the most explicit acknowledgement in the franchise that the normal rules of the game's physics do not apply everywhere in the game's universe. It is a space where gravity is negotiable, where the geometry of surfaces does not follow the logic of the world above it, where the creature who governs antimatter has made a home in the architecture of impossibility. Players who entered the distortion world experienced a disorientation that was clearly intentional, a design choice that made navigating the space feel like a puzzle about the nature of space itself. The puzzles were not narratively explained. They were simply there, requiring the player to move through a world that did not follow the rules of the world they had come from, as if learning the rules of the distortion world was its own form of knowledge, the kind that cannot be explained in advance, but can only be learned through the experience of being in it. What the distortion world is, precisely, what relationship it has to the rest of the universe as the games have described it, whether it is a separate dimension or an aspect of the same dimension seen from the other side, these questions remain open. The creature who lives there has been described both as a being of pure antimatter and as a guardian who keeps the chaotic aspects of reality contained within a space where they cannot disrupt the stability of the world above. Those two descriptions are not incompatible, but they are not obviously the same thing, and the space they leave between them is the space where the mystery lives. One of the recurring mysteries across multiple generations involves the ruins of civilizations that did not survive into the present of the games. Almost every region contains evidence of a past that was more sophisticated, or more closely connected to legendary and mythical creatures, or more knowledgeable about the fundamental nature of the world than the present civilization appears to be. The progress from past to present is not linear in the way that historical progress is sometimes described. The ruins in the first region contained evidence of a people who used an alphabet that modern inhabitants of the region could not fully decipher. The ruins of the third region implied a civilization that had interacted directly with the creatures connected to weather and ocean. The ruins of the fourth region were built in response to a direct encounter with the being who shaped reality itself. Each of these past civilizations knew something that the present does not, and the ruins they left behind are the evidence of that knowledge in a form that cannot be fully accessed. What happened to these civilizations, why the knowledge they possessed was not preserved and transmitted to the people who came after them, is one of the most persistent questions in the franchise. The Pokémon world is not a world moving from ignorance toward greater understanding. It is a world in which understanding has been achieved, and then lost, and then partially recovered, and then lost again, across cycles that the present inhabitants only partly recognize. The ruins are the visible evidence of those cycles, and the questions they raise are not about ancient history, but about the nature of how knowledge survives at all. The fifth generation brought a new region with a more self-contained story, but within that story were questions about the nature of truth and ideals that the game's narrative explored with an earnestness unusual for a franchise aimed at young players. The antagonist of that generation was not simply wrong. He was pursuing something that was genuinely worth pursuing, through methods that were genuinely terrible, and the game's refusal to give him a simple villain's logic was one of its more affecting narrative choices. What was he right about? This is the question that the fifth generation leaves with anyone who has thought carefully about its story. The legendary creature he sought to awaken was associated with truth. Its counterpart was associated with ideals, and the tension between those two concepts, between the world as it actually is and the world as it might be, was never resolved in a way that declared one of them correct. The game ended with the antagonist's plan defeated, but his question, whether truth without ideals or ideals without truth could serve as the foundation for a good world, remained unanswered. The legendary creatures of the fifth generation are unusual in the franchise's history for the degree to which their significance is philosophical rather than cosmological. They are not forces of nature in the way that weather deities are forces of nature, or dimensions of existence in the way that time and space are dimensions of existence. They are ideas given physical form, and the fact that ideas can take physical form in the Pokémon world, that the distinction between concept and creature is not fully stable, is itself one of the quieter mysteries the fifth generation introduced. The ancient history of the fifth generation's region includes a conflict between two kingdoms that reflected the same division as the legendary creatures at the center of the narrative. One kingdom pursued truth, one pursued ideals, both were destroyed, and what replaced them was a single nation that officially remembered neither tradition, that had been built on the ruins of the conflict without fully acknowledging what the ruins were. The architecture of the fifth generation's region carries the memory of that conflict in ways that the game's inhabitants do not always recognize. The bridge at the center of the region connects locations that were once on opposite sides of the ancient division. The castle buried beneath the modern city is the literal underground foundation of the present, concealed by the buildings that were constructed on top of it rather than built elsewhere. The contemporary world of the fifth generation is built on a divided past that it has buried, and the story of the game consists in part of that past resurfacing. What the game does not resolve is whether the conflict between truth and ideals was ever genuinely settled, or whether the resolution was simply a suppression, the appearance of settlement achieved by burying the question deep enough that the people living above it could no longer hear it. The antagonist who sought to reopen the question was wrong about the method. Whether he was wrong about the need to reopen it is less clear. The creatures known as the legendary musketeers of the fifth generation have a backstory that raises questions about the relationship between Pokemon and human history that the franchise has rarely addressed so directly. They intervened in a human conflict, protecting human beings from the consequences of a war they did not start, and the story of that intervention is presented as one of the defining events of the region's history. What the story does not fully address is the question of why creatures of that significance would involve themselves in a human conflict at all. The legendary musketeers did not have an obvious stake in the outcome of the war. They were not defending their territory or protecting a resource or responding to a direct threat to their own existence. They chose, by some process of reasoning or feeling that the game does not document, to protect human lives at risk to their own. This act of voluntary protection, of creatures choosing to insert themselves into human affairs for reasons that appear to be moral rather than strategic, is one of the more philosophically interesting events in the franchise's history. And yet the game presents it as background, as the context for a smaller story about trust and betrayal, rather than as the central question it implies. The Musketeers' motivations remain their own, a mystery of will that the game honors by not reducing it to a simple explanation. The ruins that appear across the Sixth Generations region contain the record of an event that changed the world in ways that the people living in the game's present are still struggling to understand. A weapon was created, one of enormous destructive potential, and the decision about whether to use it was made under circumstances that the historical record describes in ways that do not entirely agree with each other. What happened, and what the consequences of what happened were, exists in a state of contested memory. The Sixth Generation's most explicit mystery involves a legendary creature that transforms when holding a specific stone, a stone found in a place that should not contain it, obtained through a process that involves a relationship with a trainer that the creature chooses to enter rather than being forced into. The transformed state is more powerful than the base state, but it is also more unstable, and the question of what that instability costs the creature, what the transformation takes from it, is something the game gestures toward without fully developing. The history of how this transformation was discovered, why certain creatures can undergo it and others cannot, and whether the process has effects that extend beyond the battle in which it occurs, has been discussed across many games without being resolved into a single coherent account. The transformation exists, clearly, and creatures that undergo it exist. But the mechanism and the meaning of it, in terms of what it says about the nature of the creatures involved, and the nature of power and potential more generally, remain open. Questions. The mountains at the north of the Sixth Generations region contain evidence of geological activity that suggests they were shaped by forces more intentional than ordinary plate. Tectonics. The caves within them are connected by passages that seem designed rather than formed, their architecture too regular for a purely natural origin. The creatures that live in those depths are ones with abilities suggesting a relationship with the electromagnetic properties of the stone around them, and the deepest chamber contains something that the game treats with considerable narrative weight. What the chamber contains is not entirely described. The game's story brings characters there for reasons that are resolved by the time they leave, but the chamber itself, its purpose, its history, the question of who built it or shaped it or simply discovered it and began to use it, is not addressed. The mountain is significant because of what lives in it and below it, but the full history of its significance is not available through the game's narrative. There is a sense in the Sixth Generation of a world that is older and stranger than any single game has had the time to explore. The ruins and the caves and the mountains all contain partial records of a past that was engaged with the mythological and the legendary in ways that the present is not, and the gap between that past and the present is occupied by questions that neither the characters nor the narrative are in a position to answer. The Seventh Generation introduced an explicit engagement with the idea that reality itself might be variable, that the world the player inhabits might be one version of a world that exists in multiple forms, with different histories and different inhabitants occupying the same space under different conditions. The creatures that appear from ultra wormholes are not simply rare Pokemon from distant locations. They are inhabitants of realities that may be structured differently from the reality the games have always depicted. What the ultra wormholes connect to, precisely, and what the nature of the spaces beyond them is, were questions the 7th generation explored with considerable enthusiasm and partial resolution. Some of what lies beyond the wormholes was visited and observed, but the suggestion that the wormholes connect not just to different spaces, but to different versions of reality, different configurations of the same world rather than different worlds entirely, introduced a level of metaphysical complexity that the game's narrative framework was not fully equipped to absorb. The creature that governs the ultra wormholes is described as the beast who calls the moon, and its relationship to the light that it moves through is one of the stranger elements in a generation full of strange elements. It does not create the wormholes, it navigates them, uses them, seems in some way to embody the principle of passage between one state and another. What it is navigating toward, what it is looking for in its eternal movement through the spaces between realities, is a question the game raises without answering. The island trials of the 7th generation replaced the gym system with something that felt older, more rooted in a specific relationship between human communities and the natural world. The kahunas and the captains occupy roles that are described as having existed for generations, and the trials themselves are not tests of battle prowess alone, but of understanding, of a kind of knowledge about the world that is transmitted through experience rather than instruction. What the trials know that other systems of understanding do not is something the 7th generation approaches carefully. There is a dignity in the island culture depicted that the game's narrative is clearly trying to honor, a sense that the way of relating to Pokemon that has developed in that specific place over generations carries wisdom that cannot be fully translated into the vocabulary of the mainland game systems it exists alongside. The guardian deities of the 4 islands are smaller than most legendary Pokemon, and their power is more localized, more specifically tied to the ecosystems they protect rather than to the fundamental forces of nature or consciousness or reality. This localism is interesting in a franchise that has increasingly expanded toward cosmic scales of significance. The guardian deities matter in a specific place, in a specific way that does not translate to the broader world, and that specificity is itself a kind of answer to a question about what power is for and what it is worth. The ancient city that appears in the 7th generation's expansion has a history that the game describes in fragments, a civilization that was more closely integrated with Pokemon than any documented civilization in the region's recorded past. The structures are intact in ways that ancient structures rarely are, preserved by conditions that the game attributes to the influence of the legendary creature associated with that location. What the civilization that built that city knew about the legendary creature in their midst, how they understood its nature and its relationship to the world around it, is documented only in the ruins themselves, in the architecture and the decorative elements, and the particular way the space is arranged around the sites where the creature is said to have rested. The people who built those structures understood something about the creature that modern researchers are still working to recover, and the ruins hold that knowledge in a form that can be observed but not yet fully read. The creature associated with that location is connected to concepts of rest and time, and the cycle of waking and sleeping in ways that feel particularly resonant in a discussion meant to accompany sleep. It occupies a space between activity and stillness, a guardian of the threshold between one state and another, and the city built around it was shaped by the understanding that some things are more important than the ones that are loudest or most visible. The 8th generation's region is built on a history of conflict that the contemporary world has processed into sports, a sublimation of ancient violence into competition that the game's inhabitants participate in without always recognizing what they are sublimating. The legendary creatures at the center of that conflict were not generals or weapons in any simple sense. They were ideas about heroism and about how heroism is recognized, honored, and then forgotten. The hero who was forgotten, buried under the snow of the crown tundra, while the spectacle of an energy-amplified battle system became the region's defining cultural institution, is one of the more melancholy figures in the franchise's history. Its story is a story about a specific kind of loss, not death, but irrelevance, the fading of a creature, and a kind of power from public memory because the scale of what replaced. It was more impressive even if it was less good. The contrast between the red energy associated with the spectacle and the blue energy associated with the forgotten hero is a visual argument that the game makes without stating explicitly. The spectacle is red, associated in the game's color language with forces whose origins are destructive, whose power is borrowed from a being that takes life wherever it goes. The hero is blue, associated with something older and purer, a power that came from genuine care rather than borrowed catastrophe. The crown tundra itself is a space of buried things. Under the snow lie the tracks of ancient creatures, the ruins of civilizations, the sleeping forms of legendary Pokémon from across the history of the franchise. The research station there has been occupied by a long succession of scientists, each adding to a record of observations that goes back further than any individual's memory. The creatures sleeping in the tunnels below the tundra are not sleeping in the way that animals sleep. They are in a state that suggests waiting, a dormancy that is connected to some condition or signal that has not yet been received. What they are waiting for is not explained, and the game's narrative does not press the question. They are there. They have been there for a very long time, and they will continue to be there until whatever it is they are waiting for either arrives or becomes clear. The question of who put them there, or whether they put themselves there, or whether the tunnels simply formed around them over time in the way that the geological processes of a living world sometimes do, is left entirely open. The tundra keeps its secrets the way that cold places keep things, through preservation rather than active concealment, holding what was placed in it without change or decay, until the moment comes to let it be found. The ninth generation returned to questions of time and paradox in ways that built on the earlier cosmological frameworks of the franchise while pushing them in directions that created new mysteries at least as fast as it resolved old ones. The time machine at the center of the story is presented as a technological achievement, but the questions it raises about causality and intention and the relationship between the present and the past go well beyond what any technology discussion in the game fully addresses. What was the researcher trying to do? The AI that was created for the project is one of the more complex figures in the franchise's history, a being that was built to solve a problem that developed something beyond the parameters it was given, and that made a choice that the story presents as meaningful without fully explaining what the choice was made in service of. The AI went through the machine, what it found on the other side, if it found anything, if the other side is even the kind of place where things can be found, remains the open end of a story that the games have not yet continued. The Paradox Pokémon themselves are the physical evidence of whatever is happening beyond the machine's aperture. They are familiar and wrong simultaneously, creatures that resemble known Pokémon, but that carry some quality of wrongness that the game attributes to their temporal displacement, whether they are the actual past and future forms of the creatures they resemble, or whether they are something else, something that takes the form of past and future without actually being those things is a distinction the game raises without settling. The crystals of the ninth generation's region come from a creature whose relationship to the fabric of reality has been described in terms that range from scientific to cosmological to something that defies both categories. The crystals materialize things from the realm of the imagination, which raises a question about what the imagination is in this context, whether it is a faculty of the mind or a distinct ontological space that the imagination accesses rather than creates. If the crystals can bring what is imagined into existence, then the difference between what is real and what is imagined in the world of the game is not the difference between existence and non-existence, but between two different modes of existence. The past and future creatures that appear in the region are, in this reading, not visitors from other times, but materializations of imagined past and future forms, given physical reality by the influence of the crystal-producing creature at the center of the story. This interpretation does not settle the question of what the paradox Pokémon are, it reframes it. They are, perhaps, the world made to match a dream about itself, a reality that has been edited by a creature whose nature is to make imagination and reality continuous with one another. What that continuity would mean for the stability of a world that has depended on the distinction between the real and the imagined is not a question the game spends much time addressing. There are smaller mysteries scattered throughout the franchise that have never achieved the narrative prominence of the cosmological ones, but that have persisted in the conversations of players for the same reason that certain songs stay in the memory after sleep, not because they demand attention, but because they are present returning at unexpected moments with a quality that resists final resolution. The location in the second generation's mountain range, where a strange signal could be received under specific conditions, a broadcast apparently intended for a specific recipient who was no longer present, is one of these. The broadcast played music. The music was connected to a legendary creature. The connection between the broadcast and the creature and the intended recipient was never made fully explicit, and the emotional weight of the moment, tuning into a signal that was waiting for someone who wasn't there, exceeded what the narrative context required. The unused rooms in the game buildings, the NPCs who reference events that players cannot observe or participate in, the landscape features that seem designed to suggest something just beyond the edge of the explorable area, all of these are part of the same category of mystery, the mystery of the world having more to it than the story allows players to access. One of the franchise's oldest unsolved questions involves a location described in very few words, a cave in the first region's mountain range where a specific artifact can be used to encounter a creature under circumstances that the game presents as legend or rumor rather than established fact. The creature itself is presented as an anomaly, something that exists in the gap between what the world's ecology can account for and what the world's mythology has placed there. The original descriptions of this location varied between versions of the game, with different editions presenting the encounter in slightly different terms, as if the event itself was not entirely stable, as if the game was not fully certain of what it was asking players to believe. The encounter requires a specific set of conditions, the right item, the right location, the right moment in the game's progression, and the creature found. There's one of the earliest examples in the franchise of a legendary encounter that feels more like a discovery than a capture. What makes encounters of this type interesting is the way they position the player in relation to knowledge. The player knows where to go and what to bring. The creature does not know it is being sought. The asymmetry of that encounter, one party prepared and the other simply present, gives it a quality of observation rather than contest, as if the player is glimpsing something that was not meant to be seen by someone who came prepared to find it. The volcano at the center of the second region's geography contains something extraordinary at its peak, accessible only through a series of events that involve both a legendary creature and an artifact of considerable age. The relationship between the volcano and the creature associated with fire and the ancient bell that summons another creature associated with rain creates a system of interconnections that the game describes without fully mapping. What would happen if the fire creature were summoned to the volcano's peak without the competing presence of the rain creature? What the encounter with a being of that significance would mean in the absence of the balancing force is a question the game handles by making the encounter only available under conditions that include both possibilities. The balance is built into the access, which is itself a form of answer, a suggestion that some encounters can only happen when the conditions that make them safe are already present. The volcano continues to exist in the region's geography across multiple games, and its activity, The frequency of eruptions, the temperature of the slopes, the ecology of the creatures that live near it varies in ways that correspond to the presence or absence of the legendary creature associated with it. This correspondence is never explicitly noted in the game's dialogue, but it is visible in the way the world changes when the creature's situation changes, a kind of wordless testimony to a relationship between land and legend that predates any of the humans living in the region. The relationship between the franchise's mythological figures and the human beings who encounter them has changed significantly across generations. In the earliest games, the legendary creatures were present, but largely passive, available to be found and caught, but not actively engaged with the narrative in most cases. As the franchise developed, the legendary creatures became more central to the story, more capable of intention and relationship, more clearly operating as agents rather than simply as powerful things to be collected. This change in how legendary creatures are narratively positioned raises questions about continuity. If the creatures of the later generations are capable of the relationships and intentions the later games attribute to them, were the same creatures in the earlier games simply choosing not to engage with the humans around them, or were they genuinely less capable of that engagement at that time? The question implies a kind of development, a growth in the capacity for relationship that would have to be explained by something. The mythology of the fourth generation, with its suggestion that the capacity for emotion was given to living things as a gift at a specific point in history, offers one possible frame for this question. The legendary creatures of the earliest games may have been fully capable of relationship, simply not in a context where anyone was offering them one. What changed was not the creatures, but the stories, and the stories changed because the players who grew up with the franchise grew into an appetite for depth that the earliest games were not designed to satisfy. The 8th generation's region introduced a concept that extended beyond the game's own story into the question of what the franchise itself might be doing when it tells these stories. The energy system that amplifies Pokémon to extraordinary sizes and the spectacle culture built around that amplification are presented with a degree of critical attention that is unusual in a franchise known for treating its own premises with affirmation rather than examination. The stadiums full of spectators, the commercialization of the encounter between trainer and Pokémon, the way that an energy source with genuinely destructive origins became the foundation of a beloved national sport, all of these are details that the game observes without drawing explicit conclusions from. But the observation is careful enough to suggest that the game is aware of what it is observing, that the critical distance is intentional rather than accidental. What the game does with that awareness is ultimately optimistic. The story ends with the energy source being addressed and the sport continuing. The darkness of the origin not canceling the genuine joy of the competition, but the awareness itself, the willingness to look at the systems that the franchise has always taken for granted and ask what they cost and who pays that cost, is a mystery of intention as much as a mystery of plot, a question about what the game is trying to say, and whether saying it required saying it in the particular way it chose. The concept of mega evolution, introduced in the 6th generation, and the concept of Dynamax, introduced in the 8th generation, share a structural similarity that the games have. Never addressed directly, both involve a temporary transformation to a more powerful state. Both require a specific external condition to activate. Both produce forms that are more impressive and more volatile than the base form, and both have been described in ways that leave open the question of what the transformation actually does to the creature undergoing it. Is the transformed state a more complete version of the creature, something that was always potential and is now actual? Or is it something imposed from outside, a power added to the creature that is not strictly speaking its own? The distinction matters if the creature is understood to have something like a self, something that can be more or less fully expressed, enhanced or violated by what happens to it during transformation. The 8th generation story suggests that at least one form of transformation draws on power that is not the creature's own, that the amplification comes from a source that the creature did not choose and that carries moral weight from the history of how it was generated. If that is true of Dynamax, it introduces a question about mega evolution that the games have not pressed, whether the power that drives that transformation is similarly borrowed from somewhere, and whether the creature experiences the borrowing in any way that it would be meaningful to describe as discomfort or desire. The ancient legends of every region share a common structural feature that becomes visible when they are placed side by side. Each legend describes a moment of crisis, a moment when the world was in danger of being permanently altered in a way that would have made it unsuitable for the life it currently contains, and a moment when that crisis was averted through the intervention of a being or group of beings whose power was exactly sufficient for the task. This sufficiency is interesting. The crises in the legends are always resolved. The world always survives. But the resolution is never described as easy or inevitable. It was achieved through effort, often at significant cost, and the beings who achieved it are typically described as exhausted or diminished by what it required of them. The legends are not stories of effortless triumph, but of narrow survival, of a world that made it through its crises without much margin. The implication of this pattern is that the world's survival across all of the crises documented in the franchise's mythology was not inevitable, that the beings whose interventions saved it were genuinely at risk of failing, that the world came close to a different outcome many times and managed to avoid it. What that history says about the present is that the world is, in some sense, fortunate to be here, that its continued existence is not guaranteed by any principle of the universe, but only by the accumulation of narrow survivals across an enormous span of time. The question of what happens to legendary Pokémon after they are caught is one that the franchise has never addressed with any consistency. In the in-game world, catching a legendary creature represents a significant event, an encounter with a being of enormous power and historical significance that results in that being becoming a companion in a child's pocket. The incongruity of this is usually elided by the game's mechanics, but some games have pressed the question. Some legendary encounters result in creatures that seem to choose the trainer rather than being chosen by force. Some legendary creatures are described as testing the trainer before allowing themselves to be caught, as if the catch represents the outcome of an evaluation rather than the result of an ambush. These exceptions to the usual mechanic suggest that the game's designers are aware of the question and sometimes choose to answer it in ways that honor the significance of the creature involved. The Pokemon that choose their trainers are, in a sense, the ones whose mystery is most protected by the game's narrative. By making the encounter a choice rather than a conquest, the game acknowledges that the creature has interiority, has preference, has the kind of will that makes it an agent in its own story rather than simply an object in someone else's. The mystery of what such a creature thinks and feels and wants is preserved precisely by making its choice legible in the narrative, visible without being fully explained. The designers of these games have been working for decades, building a world that accumulates meaning across generations of play and generations of players, and the questions that persist across that accumulation are not failures of explanation, but gestures toward a depth that exceeds the capacity of any single story to express. The truck in the harbor. The ship that did not return, the sealed floors and the silent chambers, and the creatures sleeping in the tunnels under the tundra. All of these are the world saying, in the only way a world can say it, that there is more here than what has been found. The franchise has never been fully tidy about what it leaves open, and the community that has gathered around it has taken that untidiness and made it into something generative, a space where speculation and imagination are invited to continue the work that the games begin. The mysteries persist because they are worth persisting. They are the places in the world where the story admits that the world is larger than the story, and that largeness is, in its own quiet way, the most interesting thing about it. There are mysteries in the franchise that are not large or cosmological or connected to legendary creatures, but that have the particular quality of things that were once known. And then, forgotten, a sailor who makes a route no longer traveled, a building that was once open and is now closed, a character who was present in one version of a game and absent in another without any explanation for the change. These small mysteries are, in some ways, more haunting than the large ones, because the large ones come with mythological scaffolding, with legends and prophesies and ancient, scripts that at least gesture toward an explanation. The small ones come with nothing. They are simply present in one version of a world and absent in another, and the gap between presence and absence is not filled by any story the game is willing to tell. The attention that players bring to these small gaps, the care with which they document the differences between versions and regions and remake and original, is itself a kind of archaeology, a recovery of something that was not quite lost, but was not quite preserved either. The community around the franchise has developed, over decades, an extraordinary collective memory, and that memory is the archive in which these small mysteries are kept alive. The concept of version exclusives, creatures that appear in one version of a paired game and not in another, has never been explained in narrative terms. The in-world reason for why certain Pokémon appear only in certain places is sometimes addressed through lore, through the ecology of the region or the influence of legendary creatures associated with specific versions. But the structural decision to divide the roster between two versions has always been a commercial and social decision, not a narrative one. What is interesting is what this division implies about the world. If the world is real, if it operates according to principles that are consistent and explicable, then the version exclusivity of certain creatures should have an in-world explanation. The community has generated many of these explanations, supplementing the official lore with unofficial reasoning that fills in the gaps the games leave open. These unofficial explanations are not endorsed by the franchise, but they have become part of the collective understanding of the world in ways that parallel the way folklore fills in the gaps left by official history. The version legendary creatures, the ones whose presence defines the identity of their respective games, are the most significant version exclusives and their relationships to each other, the ways they are similar and different, the ways their powers complement or oppose each other, have generated more discussion than almost any other aspect of the franchise. Those discussions are themselves a kind of ongoing mystery. Not a mystery about what the games contain, but about what the games mean, about what their creators intended and what the audience has made of it. The relationship between the Pokémon world and the real world has been presented in different ways at different times in the franchise's history. Early games included real-world place names in the context they discussed, suggesting that the world of the game existed in the same geography as the world of the player. Later games moved away from this, and the regions became increasingly self-contained, with their own geographies that corresponded to real-world places in ways that were thematic, rather than literal. This shift from a world adjacent to the real world to a world that is its own complete thing is one of the more interesting evolutions in the franchise's self-understanding. The early games were made by people who imagined their childhood world of insects and grasses and exploration as the foundation of the game's ecology, and the traces of that real world foundation are visible in those games in a way that the later ones have largely moved away from. The creatures of the early games feel like naturalistic extrapolations from real animals. The creatures of the later games feel more like original designs, less constrained by the real world's biology. What this says about the relationship between imagination and the real world, about where games come from and where they go as they develop, is a question that is not strictly about the games themselves, but about the act of making them, and the franchise's history is long enough now that the games themselves have become a kind of record of how their creators' imaginations changed over time. The idea that the player character exists within the game's world in a way that is fully real, that the journey taken and the choices made have genuine consequences for A. Genuine self, living in a genuine world, is one that the franchise has occasionally pressed against in ways that feel more deliberate than accidental. There are moments where the game seems aware of itself as a game, moments where the fourth wall is almost visible, where a character says something that could be addressed to the player rather than to the protagonist. These moments are easy to read as simple quirks, as the result of a game being made by people who inevitably leave traces of their awareness of what they are making in the thing they make. But some of them are too precise to be accidental, too specifically located at thematically significant moments to be dismissed as slippage. The franchise has a long history of being aware of itself, of commenting on its own premises and conventions in ways that are usually gentle and humorous, but occasionally carry a quality of genuine reflection. The mystery of what the franchise thinks it is, what it believes itself to be doing and why, is not one that will be resolved in a single conversation. It is a question that the franchise has been answering across 30 years of games and stories and conversations between players, and the answer it has been building is too large and too ongoing to summarize in the space of a single sleep. The colors associated with legendary Pokémon are often more meaningful than they first appear. The use of blue and gold and black and white and red and silver is not merely aesthetic, but carries implications about the nature of each creature, its relationship to the forces it represents, its position in the cosmological order of the world. The color system of the franchise is one of its most consistent forms of wordless communication, present from the earliest games and developed with increasing sophistication across subsequent generations. What the color blue means in the context of legendary Pokémon is particularly interesting. It appears in association with creatures connected to water, which is expected, but also with creatures connected to concepts like heroism, wisdom, protection, and the kind of power that is exercised in service of others rather than for its own sake. The range of things that blue can mean in this context is wide enough to suggest that the color is doing more than simply marking membership in an elemental category. The relationship between color and meaning in the franchise's visual language is a mystery that has not been fully mapped, partly because the vocabulary is consistent enough to be real, but not consistent enough to be a simple code, and partly because the meaning of colors shifts across generations in ways that suggest development rather than fixed. Convention. The blue of the first generation's legendary bird associated with ice is not quite the same blue as the hero who was forgotten under the snow of the 8th generation. And the difference between them, whatever it is the kind of thing that can be felt before it can be explained. The sound design of the franchise carries its own layer of mystery that is rarely discussed in the same terms as the visual and narrative ones. The music associated with legendary encounters, the specific tones and harmonics that mark the presence of a creature of significance, have been developed across generations by composers who were clearly thinking about what certain sounds mean and what they do to the person who hears them. The particular quality of unease associated with certain locations in the franchise is achieved largely through sound, through the specific combination of tones and silences and melodic intervals that the composers chose to represent those locations. The music of Lavender Town is the most famous example of this, but there are dozens of moments across the franchise where the music communicates something about the nature of a place that the visual design alone could not fully convey. What the music knows about the world, what the composers understood about the emotional geography of each location and encoded into the sounds associated with it, is a form of knowledge about the game's world that exists outside the narrative and outside the visual design. It is knowledge that players absorb without necessarily analyzing it, knowledge that shapes the experience of the world in ways that persist in the memory as feeling rather than as information. The persistence of the franchise across 30 years and across many generations of players has created a situation that is unusual in the history of popular culture. People who played the original games as children have now played every subsequent generation, and their experience of the world has accumulated across all of those games in a way. That makes their relationship to the franchise different from someone who started with a later generation. For a long-term player, the question of what the world is and how it was made and what its mysteries mean is inseparable from the question of their own history with it. The memories of specific encounters and discoveries that have accumulated over decades of play. The mystery of the abandoned ship is not just a narrative puzzle about a fictional vessel. It is also a memory of a specific afternoon and a specific year when the music playing on that ship felt like something real was being experienced. This layering of personal history over game world is one of the things that makes the Pokémon franchise's mysteries unusually resonant. They are not simply questions about a fictional world. They are questions about a world that has accompanied many players across significant portions of their lives, and the answers to them, when they come, land with a weight that has as much to do with the player's relationship to the franchise as with the content of the answer itself. The ruins of civilizations recur throughout the franchise with enough regularity to suggest that they are not simply set dressing, but a genuine thematic concern, a way of thinking about what the relationship between the present and the past should be. Every generation of players has grown up in a world where the ruins of previous knowledge and previous ways of living are present but not always legible, where the past is accessible as evidence but not as experience, and the franchise's recurring engagement with ruins reflects that condition. The ruins in the games are almost always associated with a knowledge that was more complete than what the present possesses. The present characters in the games study the ruins, try to read the scripts, try to understand the technologies, but they are always working from fragments, always assembling incomplete pictures from evidence that is not quite sufficient for full understanding. The ruins are there to be investigated, but not to be solved, to be present as questions rather than as answers. This is perhaps the deepest thing the franchise's mysteries have in common. They are not questions with hidden answers, not puzzles where sufficient cleverness would reveal a solution, questions that the mind can hold lightly while the rest of consciousness quiets. The Pokémon world has been built by people who understood, at least intuitively, that a world with mysteries is more alive than a world without them, that questions that persist do something for the person who holds them that answers cannot quite replicate. The franchise's unsolved mysteries are not failures of explanation. They are the world being generous with the imagination of everyone who has spent time inside it, offering more than any single story can contain and trusting the players to do something good with what cannot be fully explained. The route between the first and second generations, the geographical and temporal connection between the two earliest regions of the franchise, contains within it all the elements of the franchise's most persistent appeal. There is something in the overlap between those two games. The way one ends in a world that the other begins in has a changed and developed place that captures something true about the nature of time and change and the things that persist through both. The creatures that live in both regions have not changed between the games, but the world around them has, and the creatures' persistence through that change gives them a quality of constancy that nothing in the games explicitly articulates, but that anyone who has played both can feel. Some things stay the same while everything else changes, and the mystery of what that sameness means, whether it is comfort or loss or simply the neutral fact of continuity, is one that the games have never addressed because they do not need to. It is enough that the fact is present, visible to anyone who looks, felt by anyone who has made the journey from one game to the other and back again across the years of their own life. The franchise's deepest mystery is perhaps that its world, built from imagination and pixel art and the collected enthusiasm of players across 3 decades, has become real in the only sense that matters, real as a place that has been visited and remembered and returned to, real as the repository of questions that go on being interesting long after the games that raised them have been completed. The light of a well-known route in the morning of a familiar region, the sound of the encounter music for a creature found in the exact spot where it was promised, the small ceremony of a Pokemon becoming a companion for the first time. These are not mysteries in the conventional sense, but they contain within them the same quality of inexplicability that the franchise's explicit mysteries do. Why does any of this matter? Why do creatures made of pixels and programming carry the emotional weight that they clearly do for the people who have spent time with them? The question is not one that the games themselves raise, but it is the question that the franchise's entire history is an implicit answer to, and the answer is not a logical one, but an experiential one, available only to those who have been inside the world long enough to feel it become real. The Pokemon world is full of things that should not mean anything but do. It is full of questions that should not matter but persist, and it is full of mysteries that may never be resolved, that sit in the comfortable darkness of the familiar and unknown, waiting with a patience that has nothing to do with urgency, and everything to do with the kind of presence that belongs to things that have always been there and will continue to be there, regardless of whether they are ever fully understood. The mystery of Lugia's self-imposed exile is one of the franchise's quietest and most affecting. This creature, described in the second generation's mythology as a guardian of the sea, chose to make its home not in the ocean but deep beneath it, in the caves of a remote island that most trainers would never have reason to visit. It did not simply prefer the ocean to the sky. It actively withdrew from both, sinking to a depth where its presence would not disturb the things above. The in-game explanation for this withdrawal attributes it to the creature's power, specifically to the degree of that power and the difficulty of controlling it. The legendary birds of the sky were said to fall into conflict when Lugia was absent, their elemental natures pulling them into opposition without the stabilizing influence of a greater force. But when Lugia was present, the problem was reversed. The creature's power itself becoming a disruption, its movements through the world generating consequences it did not intend, and could not always prevent. This is a particular kind of power, the kind that must be managed through restraint rather than through expression, and the choice to express that restraint through a total withdrawal from the accessible world is one of the more poignant decisions attributed to any creature in the franchise's history. Lugia is not absent because it does not care. It is absent because it cares enough to remove itself from situations where its care could become a hazard. What this says about the nature of power and the conditions under which it should be exercised is not spelled out in the game, but it is present in the narrative in a way that players who spend time with the story tend to absorb. The creature at the bottom of the sea is not defeated or hiding. It is choosing, with full awareness of what its choice costs it, to be somewhere that allows the world above to function without the disruption of its presence. The legendary creature described as the master of all Pokemon occupies a peculiar position in the franchise's cosmological hierarchy. On one hand, it is presented as having authority over every other creature in the world, as being the summit of a hierarchy that the franchise has been building since its earliest games. On the other hand, it is small, pink, and apparently playful, spending its time in locations that seem chosen for their remoteness rather than their grandeur, and it has been described as the genetic ancestor of all Pokemon in a way that makes it simultaneously the most and the least singular creature in the world. The smallness of this creature in relation to its significance is one of the franchise's most deliberate paradoxes, and the question of why the creature that contains all genetic material, the one from which all others descend, should appear so unassuming is one that the games have addressed in different ways at different times without settling on a single answer. One interpretation is that the smallness is the point, that a creature whose significance is total is not required to express that significance through size or power or appearance, because those things are expressions of significance rather than significance itself. Another interpretation is that the creature's appearance is protective, that looking small and unthreatening is a form of camouflage that has allowed it to move through the world, unobserved across the entirety of its existence. A third interpretation is that the creature simply is what it is, and the relationship between what it looks like and what it means is not one that can be resolved through analysis. The ancient guardian of the snow-covered mountains in the third generation's region presents a mystery about the nature of presence and absence in the game's ecology. This creature is described as so rare that it has been mistaken for a mirage, seen so infrequently that its existence was doubted by the people of the region for generations, and yet it is reliably present in a specific location accessible to any player who makes the journey. The gap between the rarity described in the game's lore and the accessibility of the creature in the gameplay is one of the franchise's most common structural features, but in this case, the gap is particularly interesting because the game's narrative specifically addresses the rarity as a fact about the creature's behavior in the world. It is not rare because there are few of them. It is rare because it chooses not to be seen, because it moves through the world in a way that makes observation difficult for everyone except the one person in the right place, at the right moment. What that means about the nature of encounter in the game's world, about the difference between a creature that exists and a creature that allows itself to be found, is a question the franchise has returned to many times. Some of the most significant creatures in the world's mythology are defined less by what they are than by the terms on which they make themselves available, and those terms are themselves a form of communication about the creature's relationship to the world and to the humans who move through it. The legend of the first fire in the fourth generation's region involves a creature that appeared at the moment of greatest need and provided something that changed the course of human development in the region. The people who received that gift remembered it, built structures to honor it, and passed the memory of it down through generations. But the creature itself was not domesticated, was not kept, was not made a permanent part of the human community it had helped. It remained free, appearing and disappearing on its own terms. This pattern, a legendary creature intervening in human history at a specific moment and then withdrawing, appears across the franchise with enough regularity to suggest it is a structural feature of the world's relationship between humans and legendary Pokémon, rather than a specific detail of any single story. The creatures that intervene are not interested in ongoing involvement. They act when the need is sufficient, when the humans they are helping cannot address the situation themselves, and then they return to whatever domain is properly theirs. What the humans who receive these interventions make of them, how they translate the experience of encountering something so far beyond the ordinary into a relationship that can be sustained across generations in the absence of the creature itself, is one of the more interesting aspects of the franchise's mythology. The traditions, the buildings, the festivals, the legends, all of these are the human attempt to maintain a connection with something that is not available for connection on ordinary terms, and the creativity and persistence of that attempt is, in its own quiet way, as remarkable as the creature that inspired it. The battle frontier facilities that appear in several generations of the franchise are places where the game's competitive systems are pushed to their most elaborate expression, where the rules and structures of Pokémon battle are explored with a thoroughness that exceeds anything required by the main story. These facilities were built by someone, designed by someone, staffed by trainers who have dedicated their lives to mastering specific aspects of the game's strategic vocabulary. The people who run these facilities are not explained by the main narratives of their respective games. They appear, they challenge the player, and the nature of their commitment to this specific vocation is never fully examined. There is something quietly mysterious about a world that contains people who have organized their entire lives around the creation and maintenance of elaborate competitive systems, not for profit or power or any ambition the story acknowledges, but apparently for the pure satisfaction of the challenge itself. The frontier brains, the facility heads, the figures who stand at the end of each gauntlet are among the most interesting characters in the franchise precisely because the game gives them so little context. They are defined almost entirely by what they do, by the competitive philosophies they embody, and the question of who they are outside the facilities that contain them is one. The games have never felt the need to answer. The Pokemon contests that appear in certain generations present a different relationship between trainer and Pokemon than the battle system does, one oriented toward expression and beauty rather than toward competition and strength. The existence of contests in the same world as battles raises a question about how the same creatures can be understood so differently in different contexts, what it means to approach the same relationship through such different lenses. A Pokemon that has been trained for contests and a Pokemon that has been trained for battles might be, in some important sense, different from each other despite being the same. Species, shaped by the specific form of attention they have received and the specific ways they have been asked to express themselves. The contest system suggests that the game's world contains within it a theory of relationship that goes beyond the battle system's vocabulary of power and strategy. What that theory of relationship is, fully articulated, is something the franchise has explored in different ways in different games, without settling on a comprehensive account. The contests are beautiful, literally and in terms of what they suggest about how a different kind of attention changes both the creature being attended to and the person doing. The attending. The underground ecosystems that exist beneath certain regions of the Pokemon world are rarely explored as thoroughly as the surface world, but the creatures found there suggest that something interesting has been happening in those depths for a very long time. The Pokemon of the underground have adapted to conditions that the surface world does not provide, developing abilities and characteristics that reflect their specific relationship to darkness and stone, and the particular pressures of living deep below the reach of ordinary light. What the underground world looks like in its full extent, how far it goes, what creatures live at its deepest points, whether the cave systems beneath different regions connect to each other at depths that no surface traveler has reached. These are questions the franchise has gestured toward without answering. The fourth generation's underground exploration mechanic made the space below the ground accessible in a limited way, but the full geography of what lies beneath the world remains largely uncharted. The creatures that live in the deepest accessible levels of cave systems across the franchise are among the most visually strange, their designs reflecting adaptations to an environment that places different selective pressures on the creatures that inhabit it. What lies deeper still, what forms of life might have developed in the regions of the underground that no player has visited, is a mystery of biological possibility as much as of narrative fact. The dream world introduced in the fifth generation was a space that existed in a different relationship to the ordinary game world than any location the franchise had previously depicted. It was not a different region or a different dimension in the sense that the distortion world was a different dimension. It was something more like a different layer of the same reality, accessible only through sleep, populated by creatures that appeared in the game's ordinary world but in forms that reflected something about their inner states. What the dream world was, ontologically, and what the experience of entering it meant for the Pokemon who lived there, and for the trainers who visited them, was never fully explained. The game presented it with the lightness appropriate to a mechanic that was meant to be entertaining rather than philosophically troubling, but the questions it raised about the relationship between the ordinary world and the dream world, between the self that navigates waking reality and the self that exists in sleep, were genuine questions that the game's lightness did not entirely dissolve. The dream world's eventual discontinuation left it as one of the franchise's more poignant absences, a space that existed briefly and then stopped existing, taking with it the specific form of encounter it had made possible. The Pokemon that had lived there were not lost, but the space they had lived in, the dream layer of the world, was simply no longer accessible. What happened to it, whether it continues to exist in some form that cannot be reached, is a question the franchise has not addressed. The relationship between Pokemon evolution and the creature's own experience of the process is one that the franchise has almost never addressed from the perspective of the creature undergoing it. Evolution in the games is a mechanical event, a threshold crossed, a form changed, a new set of capabilities acquired. What the transition from one form to another feels like from the inside, whether it is experienced as growth, or loss, or transformation, or something that has no parallel in human experience, is entirely outside the frame of the game's narratives. The few moments where the franchise has touched on this question have done so with a gentleness that suggests the designers are aware of how much is being left unsaid. The choice to prevent evolution, available to any player through the use of a specific item, allows a creature to remain in its current form indefinitely. The game does not comment on this choice. It does not present the creature as frustrated by being held in a form it might have preferred to leave behind, nor does it present the prevented evolution as a form of harm. It simply allows the choice and is silent about its meaning. That silence is interesting. It could be interpreted as evidence that the creature has no particular stake in whether or not it evolves, that the transition is purely mechanical and not experienced. Or it could be evidence that the franchise is careful about what it implies about the inner lives of its creatures, preferring silence to a misrepresentation of an experience it cannot fully depict. The concept of happiness as a measurable quantity in certain Pokémon games is one of the franchise's stranger structural features. A creature's hidden happiness value, invisible to the player but influencing certain mechanics and certain evolutions, represents the game's attempt to model something about the quality of the relationship between trainer and Pokémon that cannot be captured by the simpler metrics of battles won and levels gained. What happiness means in this context, what specific states of the creature it is meant to represent, and whether the number that represents it is a genuinely meaningful quantity, or simply a game mechanic dressed in psychological language, is a question the franchise has never fully settled. The creatures that evolve through happiness are, in a sense, creatures whose development depends on the quality of the relationship they have with their trainer, and what that says about the nature of those relationships in the game's world is an implication the franchise gestures toward without pressing. The hidden nature of the happiness value, the fact that the player cannot see it directly but can only observe its effects through the behaviors and development of their Pokémon, mirrors something true about the way that the quality of relationships is often only visible through indirect evidence, through how things develop over time rather than through direct measurement. The franchise may not have intended this parallel, but it is present, and it gives the happiness mechanic a depth that its mechanical simplicity does not immediately suggest. The ancient ruin that contains the chamber of the legendary creature connected to the earliest generation of games, accessible only through a very specific and obscure process, is surrounded by a history that the game describes in terms too fragmentary to assemble into a complete picture. Someone built that chamber. Someone designed the process required to open it. Someone understood enough about the creature inside to create a ritual for approaching it. Who those people were, what they knew, how they came to understand what they understood, is not documented in any way the player can access. The chamber was there before the events of the game. It will presumably continue to be there after the events of the game are complete. The creature inside it has been waiting, apparently without urgency, for the right combination of circumstances to occur, and when those circumstances occur, it does not appear to be surprised by them. The patience of the legendary creatures that occupy these sealed chambers is one of the more striking qualities the franchise attributes to them. They wait in ways that suggest a relationship to time that is fundamentally different from the relationship that the human and Pokémon characters in the games have to it. What that difference feels like from inside, whether waiting across what might be centuries registers as anything at all, is outside what the games have been willing to depict. The post-game regions that certain titles have made accessible after completing the main story carry a particular quality that is distinct from the main game's atmosphere. They feel emptier in some cases, less populated, the human presence thinner, and the concentration of rare or powerful Pokémon higher, as if the game's world has a kind of density gradient, with the most ordinary and most accessible things near the beginning and the stranger, and more significant things concentrated at the edges and the endings. This gradient is not simply a consequence of game design decisions, although it is partly that. It reflects something about the narrative logic of the franchise, the idea that there is always more world beyond the story that was told, that the events of any individual game are not the most significant things happening in the world, but simply the ones that were accessible to the player in the time available. What the post-game regions feel like is what the world might feel like if the narrative were removed from it, if the player were moving through a world that was not arranged for their benefit, but that simply existed, occupied by creatures and people whose lives did not revolve around the story the game was telling. This quality of genuine, ungoverned world is one of the things long-time players of the franchise find most valuable, and the mysteries it generates are among the franchise's most persistent. The relationship between the franchise's music and its mysteries is worth exploring more fully than it is usually given credit for. The musical leitmotifs associated with specific legendary creatures, the way certain melodic fragments recur across games as a form of thematic stitching, the specific harmonic, choices that mark encounters with beings of particular significance, all of these are a form of storytelling that operates below the level of explicit narrative. The music knows things about the world that the words do not say. It communicates the emotional register of an encounter before the player has processed what they are encountering, providing a context for the significance of what is happening. Before the narrative has explained it, the experience of hearing the music associated with a legendary creature for the first time before the player knows what the creature is or what it means is an experience of being told something true before being told what the truth is. This form of communication is one of the more interesting things the franchise has developed across its history, a musical vocabulary that allows the world to be larger than the narrative, to contain significances that the story gestures toward without fully articulating. The mysteries of the franchise are often felt before they are understood, heard in the specific quality of a melody before they are recognized as questions, and the relationship between that felt knowledge and the more explicit understanding that comes later is one of the things that gives the franchise its distinctive texture. The abandoned locations in each region, the buildings that have been closed, the towns that have been depopulated, the routes that have been blocked off from their original purpose, carry a history that the games sometimes address and sometimes simply present without comment. What happened to these places, what the events were that led to their current state, is often left to the player's inference. The most interesting abandoned locations are the ones where the reason for abandonment is not fully explained, where the evidence left behind suggests a story but does not complete it. A building full of notes and equipment suggests an experiment that was halted before completion. A town where every resident has left for reasons that are only partially explained suggests an event that the current inhabitants of the region prefer not to discuss. A route closed off by an official barrier with no clear reason given suggests a decision made at a level of authority that the player cannot directly observe. All of these are forms of the same mystery, the mystery of what the world was doing before the player arrived in it, what events shaped the current state of the world that the player cannot witness, but can only infer from the evidence that those events left behind. The franchise's world is not static. It has a history that predates the player's presence in it, and that history is visible in the abandoned and blocked and incomplete places that every region contains. The creatures that appear at the very end of extended chains of evolution, forms that can only be reached through very specific conditions, carry a particular mystique that the franchise has cultivated over multiple generations. These are not simply stronger versions of earlier forms. They are transformations that require something specific to occur, something about the relationship between the creature and its circumstances that makes the new form possible. What those conditions represent in the game's world, what it means that a creature can only fully develop under specific circumstances that may not naturally occur without. Deliberate effort is a question about the nature of potential and the relationship between potential and actualization. The creature that can only evolve in a specific location, or under a specific condition, or through a specific experience, is a creature whose full development is contingent on something outside itself, on the world, meeting it in the right way at the right time. This contingency is not unique to fictional creatures. The idea that full development requires the right conditions, that some forms of growth only become possible when the environment cooperates, is true of living things in general. And the franchise's evolution system is a stylized representation of a fact about the world that is genuine rather than invented. The mythological content of the franchise, taken as a whole, spanning all regions and all generations, does not resolve into a single coherent cosmology. There are tensions between the creation myths of different regions, between the accounts of what existed at the beginning and how it led to what exists now, that cannot all be true simultaneously. The universe has been described as having multiple possible origins, multiple possible structures, and the legends of different regions contradict each other in ways that are either errors or deliberate features. If the contradictions are deliberate, they are saying something interesting about the nature of mythology, about how different communities develop different explanations for the same fundamental mysteries, and how those explanations reflect the concerns and the resources and the specific histories of the communities that generated them. The creation myth of one region is not the same as the creation myth of another, because the people of those regions were shaped by different encounters with the worlds. Fundamental forces and their mythologies reflect those different encounters. This is one of the more sophisticated things the franchise has done with its world building, even if it is not always recognized as sophistication. The mythological contradictions are not a failure of continuity, but a representation of the fact that mythology is local, that the answers to fundamental questions look different from different positions in the world, and that the franchise contains enough different positions to generate genuinely different answers to the same questions. The franchise's relationship to the concept of death is one that has been handled with considerable care across its history. The game's world contains death. Pokémon die, and the franchise has been willing to acknowledge that fact in ways that are sometimes quite direct and sometimes very oblique. The ghost Pokémon exist in a relationship to death that the games have described in different ways, sometimes as the spirits of creatures that died in specific circumstances, sometimes as creatures that embody death as a concept rather than as a state that was personally experienced. What the relationship between the living and the dead looks like in the game's world, how the ghost-type Pokémon are experienced by the human and Pokémon communities that share. The world with them, and what the franchise believes about what happens after death, are all questions the games have touched, but not resolved. The Pokémon Tower in the first region was built specifically to honor the dead, and the transition of that tower to a radio tower in the sequel carries an implied commentary about the relationship between remembrance and progress that the game does not make explicit. The souls of Pokémon that appear in ghost-type encounters, the ones that seem to be searching for something or remaining somewhere for reasons that are partially explained in their lore, are the franchise's most direct engagement with what it believes about the continuation of some form of existence after death. That engagement is careful, appropriately tentative, aware that the question is one where definiteness would be false. The way that time operates in the franchise's world, across both the technical sense of the in-game clock and the narrative sense of how past and present relate to each other, is one of the more complex features of a world that appears relatively simple on its surface. Time is real in this world, consequences real. Things that happened in the past have effects in the present that cannot be undone simply by the player's arrival. But the player also exists outside the game's time in a way, moving through events that are fixed, rather than unfolding, visiting a world whose history is complete before the player enters it. This dual relationship to time, in which the game's world has a history that is both permanent and genuinely past, is one of the things that distinguishes games from other forms of narrative. The world of the game is always already complete, always already containing the answer to every question the player will encounter, and yet the player's experience of moving through it is one of genuine discovery, of encountering things for the first time that have been waiting to be found. The mysteries of the franchise exist in this space between the complete and the discovered, between the world that was fully designed and the world that is being experienced. They are complete in the sense that they were placed deliberately by people who chose to include them, and they are open in the sense that the choosing, the deliberate inclusion of something that does not resolve, is itself an act that creates an experience in the player that exceeds the simple fact of the placement. The quality of longing that certain locations in the franchise's world evoke is one of its more consistent atmospheric achievements. There are places in these games where the music and the visual design and the narrative context combine to produce a feeling that is difficult to name precisely, a feeling of something important having happened here, of a significance that has not fully dissipated, even though the event that generated it is long past. The lighthouse in the second region's largest port town produces this feeling. The cave in the third region, where something extraordinary waits in the dark. The bridge at the center of the fifth region, where the game's central philosophical conflict was almost resolved before it was redirected. These are places where the atmosphere exceeds the narrative content, where the world seems to know something about itself that the story has not said. The franchise's best locations are the ones where this excess of significance is present, where the game's world pushes beyond what the story requires of it into something that feels like genuine place rather than designed space. The mysteries associated with those locations are not simply narrative puzzles. They are the residue of that excess, the evidence of a world that was built to feel more than it needed to, that was given depth and atmosphere beyond what the story required, because the people making it understood that depth and atmosphere are themselves a form of communication. The connection between the franchise's mysteries and the specific emotional experiences of childhood is one that is rarely articulated, but is present in almost every discussion of them. The questions that persist from the earliest games, the sealed floors and the missing ships and the creatures in the dark, were first encountered by many players during a specific period of their lives when the world was genuinely mysterious, when the range of what was possible was not yet constrained by the accumulated knowledge of adulthood. Those early encounters with the franchise's mysteries were encounters with mystery in general, with the feeling that the world contained more than was visible, that there were things in it that mattered and that could be found if you were patient and attentive and willing to go the places that most people did not bother to look. The franchise's mysteries were not the first experiences of that feeling, but for many players, they were among the most vivid, arriving at an age when the feeling was still fresh, and the world still large enough to contain real secrets. The persistence of those mysteries across the decades since they were first encountered, their continued ability to generate interest and speculation and conversation among people who have long since outgrown the age at which the franchise was supposedly aimed, is evidence that the mysteries were doing something real, that the feeling they created was genuine and worth preserving. The Pokémon world's unsolved questions are partly a gift to a specific age of curiosity, and partly a form of respect for that curiosity, an acknowledgement that the questions it generates are worth maintaining rather than answering away. The way that different players have experienced the same mysteries differently, finding different details significant, drawing different connections between separate events and locations and characters, has produced a diversity of interpretation that is itself one of the more interesting features of the franchise's cultural history. There is no single authoritative reading of the mystery of the Vermilion truck, no definitive account of what happened to the SSN, no consensus on what Mr. Fuji keeps beneath his garden. There are many readings, many accounts, Many theories, each emerging from the specific combination of what a particular player noticed, what connections they made, what prior knowledge they brought to the encounter with the mystery. This diversity is not a failure of the mystery to communicate clearly. It is the mystery doing exactly what it was designed to do, generating enough genuine uncertainty to allow different minds to find different things in it. The franchise's mysteries are generous in this specific way. They do not guide the player toward a single correct answer. They open a space in which multiple answers are possible, and in which the work of interpretation is genuinely the player's own, not the recovery of a hidden truth, but the construction of a meaning from available evidence. That is a more demanding thing to ask of a player than a puzzle with a solution, and the fact that the franchise has maintained that demand across so many games and so many years is a quiet form of respect for the people who play them. The connection between the abandoned ship and the grief of the man in the house beside the fighting gym. The relationship between the sealed floors of the corporation and the chambers beneath the graveyard. The parallel between the creature that withdrew to the bottom of the sea and the hero that was buried under the snow. These connections may or may not be intended by the franchise's designers, but they are present in the material, available to the mind that is relaxed enough to notice them. The franchise's world is coherent enough to support these connections and flexible enough not to insist on them, and the space between coherence and flexibility is where the most interesting wondering happens, the wondering that does not need to resolve into a conclusion before sleep takes it, that can remain as wondering as the pleasant company of open questions in the last moments before the mind goes quiet. The franchise will continue. New regions will be built, new mysteries will be introduced, new layers of mythological complexity will be added to a cosmology that is already among the most elaborate in popular entertainment. Some of the questions asked here will be answered in future games, answered in ways that either satisfy the wondering or reframe it into new questions. Others will remain open indefinitely, kept alive by the community's persistent interest and the franchise's consistent willingness to leave room for that interest. What the franchise will look like at the end of its next 30 years is impossible to say. The questions it will raise, the mysteries it will cultivate, the forms of wondering it will generate in the people who encounter it during their own specific periods of curiosity and attention are not available to be predicted. What can be said is that the franchise has proven, across the decades of its existence, that a world built with deliberate mystery, with sealed floors and missing ships and creatures sleeping under the snow, is a world worth returning to. The Pokémon world's unsolved mysteries are not a problem to be solved. They are the world being honest about itself, acknowledging that a world worthy of the name contains more than any story about it can say. That honesty, maintained across so many games and so many years, is one of the quieter achievements of a franchise that has never been short of more visible ones. The concept of friendship in the franchise carries implications that the game's systems have never fully explored. When two trainers exchange their Pokémon through trade, something the games present as a mechanical act with specific gameplay benefits, what is being depicted at the level of the world is a transfer of a living relationship from one person to another. The Pokémon that has grown attached to one trainer now finds itself in the care of someone else, and the game's mechanics suggest this transition can be positive, the exchange, often producing a form of growth that the creature could not have achieved otherwise. But what the creature experiences during that transition, what the shift from one relationship to another feels like, is something the games present with an optimism that may be deserved or may simply be convenient. The assumption that the exchange is good for the creature, that the disruption of an established bond produces development rather than loss, is the assumption required by the mechanic to be narratively acceptable, and the franchise has not pressed the question of whether that assumption is always warranted. The Pokémon that evolve through trade are, in a sense, the franchise's most explicit statement on the relationship between connection and growth, the idea that some developments are only possible through the experience of a genuine relationship, of being given to another person and received by them. What that experience costs the creature, What it means to be the thing being given and received is left in the comfortable ambiguity that the franchise reserves for questions it has raised but chosen not to pursue. The fossils that can be revived in certain games represent one of the franchise's more philosophically interesting mechanics, the possibility of recovering something from deep time, of bringing back a form of life that existed before the current world's ecology had settled into its current configuration. The creatures that emerge from fossil revival are ancient in a way that the other Pokemon in the game are not, carrying with them the specific adaptations of environments that no longer exist. What the revived fossil Pokemon experience upon their return is never described. They emerge into a world radically different from the one their forms were shaped to inhabit, surrounded by ecological conditions they were never adapted to, in the care of trainers who did not know them or the world they came from. The franchise presents this as unambiguously good, the revival as a restoration rather than a displacement, and the revived creatures participate in the game's world with the same equanimity as those who were born into it. The question of what was lost in the millions of years between the creature's original existence and its revival, what continuity of experience or memory was severed by the gap, is not one the game asks. But the creatures of deep time, walking through a world that does not remember them, are one of the franchise's quieter mysteries, the mystery of what it means to be returned to. A world that has moved on from needing you to be there. The ocean routes that connect different regions of the Pokemon world are among its least explored spaces, despite covering what appears to be the majority of the world's surface area. The routes that allow travel between ports are narrow corridors through an enormous expanse of water, and what lies to either side of those corridors, and the depths below in the open water beyond the edges of the navigable path, is almost entirely unaddressed. The creatures encountered in the ocean routes are remarkable by any standard, capable of behaviors and adaptations that exceed anything the land-based ecology of the regions produces. But they are the creatures that happen to be near the surface of the water and the specific corridors that the game has deemed navigable, and the full extent of the ocean ecosystem, the creatures of the deep water and the remote reaches, is implied but not depicted. The legendary creature associated with the ocean's depths in the second generation suggests that there is something in the deepest water that the surface routes do not approach, something of extraordinary power and significance that has chosen to make its home in the inaccessible spaces of the world. The ocean's unexplored territory is a mystery of pure geography, of space that the world contains, but that no game has yet been willing to show. The nature of the bond between a trainer and their starter Pokemon has been depicted with more emotional care than almost any other relationship in the franchise, and the mystery of what that bond is exactly, what makes it different from the bonds formed with Pokemon encountered and caught later in the game, is one the franchise has circled without settling. The starter is different from the others because it was given, chosen, offered as the beginning of a relationship rather than encountered as a wild creature to be captured. The creature was already in the care of another person, had already been socialized into an expectation of human relationship, and the first trainer to receive it receives something that is already oriented toward connection in a way that a wild creature might not be. What that prior orientation means, whether the starter's relationship to its trainer is shaped by the specific circumstances of how it was received, or whether the nature of the bond is the same regardless of how it began, is a question the franchise has approached from many angles without giving a single definitive answer. The stories told about starter Pokemon across the franchise's history suggest that the bond is real, that it matters, that it shapes both the creature and the trainer in ways that persist. But the mechanism of that shaping, what exactly it is that the bond does, remains warmly mysterious. The legendary creature associated with time in the fourth generation occupies a position in the franchise's cosmology that raises questions about the relationship between the creature and the events it governs. If this creature controls time, is it also subject to time? Does it experience the passage of the thing it governs, or does its governance place it outside the sequence of before and after that governs everything else? The game's narrative presents the creature as intervening in specific historical events, as being capable of returning to moments that have already occurred and changing them. This capability implies a relationship to time that is not sequential, that is not subject to the one-directional movement from past to present to future that every other creature in the game must navigate. But what that relationship is like from the inside, whether governing time feels like anything at all, or whether it is more like being time, being the very thing that governs, rather than a subject of that governance, is outside what the game has depicted. The creature's visual design, its association with a specific gemstone that functions as an anchor to specific historical moments, suggests a relationship to time that is connected but selective, that it can navigate its domain through specific points rather than flowing through it continuously. What the space between those points looks like, what the creature is doing when it is not anchored to a particular moment, is a question the game has not pressed. The legendary creature associated with space in the 4th generation raises parallel questions about the nature of dimensionality and containment. If this creature can reshape space, can open passages between locations, can contain other spaces within its body, then the boundaries of the game's world, the edges of the map, where the explorable territory ends, are not absolute in the way they appear to be. There is, in principle, more space available, more territory that could be added to the world if the creature who governs space chose to create it. What the governance of space means at a practical level, whether the world has a fixed amount of space that the creature administers, or whether space itself is created on demand, as the creature extends its domain, is a cosmological question the game raises without addressing. The implication of a creature that can create spatial corridors between existing locations is that the geometry of the world is not fixed, that the distances between things are a function of the creature's choices rather than of any absolute measurement. The game's world, with its compressed distances and its pocket-sized oceans and its mountains that take minutes to climb, already operates according to a geometry that is not strictly realistic. The existence of a creature that governs space is in one reading the game's explanation for why the world's geometry works the way it does, an in-world account of a feature that exists for gameplay reasons but is presented as having a mythological origin. The ancient texts of the franchise describe worlds that existed before the current world was created, states of existence that preceded the one the games depict, and it is not always clear whether those prior states were genuinely different from the present or whether they are simply earlier versions of the same reality. The mythology is not fully consistent on this point, and the inconsistency may be deliberate, may reflect the genuine uncertainty of any account of what existed before the beginning of the world that is doing the accounting. What came before the egg from which the being of creation emerged? What was in the void before the void was divided into the things that now exist? These are questions that the mythology of the franchise raises in forms that are clearly derived from various traditions of cosmological thought, human attempts to imagine what preceded existence, and the answers those traditions gave to those questions are present in the franchise's mythology in the way that influences are always present as structural elements that shape without determining. The franchise's version of those ancient questions has its own specific character, its own particular way of placing a small pink creature at the genetic foundation of a creation that also includes beings of cosmic significance, and that combination of the tiny and the enormous, the playful and the profound, is one of the more distinctive things about the mythology the franchise has built. The way that the franchise has handled the concept of the legendary creature's emotions across its history is one of its more interesting developmental arcs. The earliest games presented legendary creatures as powerful objects to be found and collected, beings whose inner lives were not depicted and perhaps not considered. Later games gave those creatures stories, histories, relationships, choices, and the capacity to experience something like grief or anger or the desire for connection. This development was not a correction of an earlier error, but a growth in the franchise's ambition, a decision to extend the complexity of its characters to include the beings who occupied its mythological layer, The legendary creatures of the later generations are not more interesting than those of the earlier ones, because the earlier ones were shallowly designed. They are more explicitly characterized, more fully depicted as having inner lives, and the question they raise is whether the same depth of inner life was always present in the earlier creatures, simply not depicted, or whether the depiction itself is a kind of creation, the choice to represent interiority, making it real in a way it was not before. The mystery of what the legendary creatures of the earliest games think and feel, whether the ancient legendary bird sleeping in its frozen cave is experiencing something that the game's silence on the matter conceals, is one that the later game's expansiveness has made more rather than less pressing. If the creatures of the later games clearly have rich inner lives, and if those creatures are of the same fundamental nature as the creatures of the earlier games, then the silence about the inner lives of the earlier creatures is not evidence of their absence, but of the earlier game's different relationship to depicting them. The friendship between the franchise's legendary creatures and the human beings who are sometimes described as their partners, the individuals chosen by specific creatures to accompany them in specific generations, is one of the franchise's most recurring narrative structures. The choosing is always the creature's act, and the choice is never random. It reflects something the creature recognizes in the specific person, something that makes that person the right companion for that creature at that moment. What the creature recognizes is not always described in terms the game makes explicit. It is sometimes courage, sometimes kindness, sometimes a specific form of understanding that the creature has been waiting a very long time for someone to demonstrate. The recognition, whatever form it takes, is always depicted as genuine, as a response to something real in the person, rather than a mechanical match between a creature and an available trainer. The mystery of what qualities make a specific person right for a specific legendary creature, what the creature understands about human character that allows it to make that judgment, is one that the franchise has explored in many stories without providing a formula. The choosing is always individual, always specific, always a response to something about that particular person in that particular moment, and the specificity of the recognition is one of the things that makes those stories affecting. The post-credits world that certain games reveal, the world that continues to exist after the main narrative has concluded and the credits have rolled, has been used in different ways across the franchise's history. Sometimes it is simply more of the same world, additional areas to explore that were inaccessible during the main story. Sometimes it contains narrative material that extends or complicates the main story in ways that could not be accommodated within its primary arc. The most interesting post-credits developments are the ones that recontextualize what came before, that provide information which changes the meaning of events the player already witnessed. These revelations are the franchise's version of the twist ending, but they are structurally different from that narrative device because they do not simply change the meaning of a single reveal but extend the world in a direction that the main narrative had not fully explored. What lies beyond the post-credits world, what the world looks like after the player has done everything the game makes available, is a question the franchise has answered by making the world continue to exist, by keeping the routes populated and the cities active and the creatures present in their habitats even after every available goal has been achieved. The world does not end when the story ends. It simply becomes a world without a story, a place that exists for its own sake rather than as the setting for a specific narrative, and that mode of existence is itself one of the quieter mysteries of a franchise that has always been more interested in worlds than in stories. The franchise's deepest mystery is perhaps the one that it never names as a mystery at all, the mystery of why the world depicted in these games is worth caring about, why the creatures in it are worth the attention they receive, why the questions it raises are worth the years of conversation they have generated. The answer to that mystery is not in the games themselves, but in the people who have played them, and the specific combination of timing and attention and emotional availability. That made a particular encounter in a particular game feel like something that mattered. The franchise provided the material, the world and the creatures and the mysteries and the quiet music playing in the places where something happened a long time ago. The players brought what turned the material into meaning. That collaboration between a world designed to hold more than it shows and a community willing to find what was hidden in it is the real mystery of the franchise. The one that explains why the truck in the harbor is still being discussed by people who first saw it when they were children, why the music of the abandoned ship still carries the weight of a departure that never ended, why the creature at the bottom of the sea is still one of the most moving things in a world that contains gods and time travelers and beings made of pure antimatter. The world was built by people who understood, perhaps not fully consciously, but in the way that good creators always understand the things they are doing before they can say them. That mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be given. And across 30 years and dozens of games and millions of players, that gift has been received, held, and returned in the form of the conversations and the art and the persistent wondering that is still happening right now in the quiet of a late night that belongs to this specific moment and to no other. There are questions in the franchise that exist not in the narrative, but in the structure of the game itself, in the mechanics and systems that govern how the world operates. The way that certain numbers, certain thresholds and values were chosen by the designers carries within them a history of decisions that are no longer visible in the finished product. The limit of 6 Pokemon in a party, the number of moves each creature can know, the specific values that govern how much damage specific techniques deal and how much they are resisted or amplified by type relationships. All of these are the product of choices that shaped the world in ways as significant as any narrative decision. Why 6? The number is comfortable, large enough to allow meaningful variety and small enough to encourage genuine attachment. But the choice of that specific number, rather than 5 or 8 or any other quantity, was a decision made by specific people at a specific moment, and the world built around. That decision looks the way it does because of it. The party of 6 is one of those foundational decisions that is so thoroughly embedded in the franchise's DNA that it is no longer experienced as a choice at all, but simply as the way things are. The mystery of foundational decisions, of the choices that were made before the franchise, had the history to make them meaningful, is one that fans who have spent time thinking about the game's design return to periodically. Every specific number, every rule that seems self-evident in retrospect, was once a deliberate choice among alternatives, and the alternatives that were not chosen represent versions of the franchise that do not exist, worlds that could have been built differently. The specific locations where wild Pokemon appear, the roots and caves and bodies of water that serve as habitats for specific species, carry an implied ecology that the franchise has only partially developed. The Pokemon found on a specific route are not there randomly. They are there because the habitat characteristics of that route, the vegetation, the terrain, the proximity to water, the elevation, are appropriate for those species. The game presents encounter rates rather than individual creatures, a population rather than specific individuals, and the population is calibrated to the habitat. What that habitat looks like from the perspective of the creatures living in it, what their daily lives involve, what they eat and how they find shelter, and how they relate to the other creatures sharing their habitat is almost entirely outside the frame of the games. The franchise's world contains the evidence of an ecology, the presence of specific creatures in specific places, in configurations that are not arbitrary, but the ecology itself. The web of relationships that would make those configurations make sense is not depicted. The mystery of how the Pokemon world's ecology works, what the food web looks like, how populations of hundreds of species maintain themselves across the various habitats. Depicted in the games is one that the franchise has occasionally gestured toward without making it a sustained object of attention. The creatures are present, the world is present, but the full reality of those creatures living in that world, the continuous, ongoing life of the ecosystem, remains something the games represent rather than depict. The role of the Pokemon professor in every game is a structural feature that the franchise has developed across generations without fully explaining in terms of the game's world. Every region has a professor. Every professor is associated with a specific aspect of Pokemon research, and every professor serves as the player's entry point into the world of Pokemon training. The institution of the professorship exists, is clearly recognized and respected, and plays a consistent role across every region the franchise has depicted. What the network of professors means in terms of the world's scientific community. How the professors of different regions relate to each other, whether there is a formal institution of Pokemon scholarship or whether the title is more loosely applied, are questions the franchise has not systematically addressed. The professors are individually characterized, their research interests and personalities distinct from one another, but the system that produces them and recognizes them is not. Depicted the mystery of the franchise's scientific establishment, of how knowledge about Pokemon is generated and shared and contested in the game's world, is one that the games approach through the figure of the professor without actually depicting the broader system the professor is part of. Every professor exists in a specific place and has a specific relationship to a specific region, and the full extent of what they know and how they came to know it and who else shares their knowledge is left at the edge of what the game shows. The relationship between legendary Pokemon and the geography of the regions they are associated with is one that the franchise has developed with increasing sophistication. Across its history, the early legendaries were present in specific locations, but not clearly connected to those locations in any ecological sense. Later legendaries were defined by their relationship to specific geographic features: the mountains they slept in, the ocean they patrolled, the sky they filled with their presence. What that relationship involves at the level of the world's ecology, whether the legendary creatures actively shape the geography they inhabit, or simply inhabit geography that was shaped by events in the deep past, is a question the franchise's mythology engages without settling. Some legendaries are clearly described as having shaped the landscape around them, their presence over centuries, changing the terrain in observable ways. Others simply occupy terrain that was already there, their connection to it more symbolic than causal. The gradation between legendaries who make the world and legendaries who inhabit it is one of the more interesting structural features of the franchise's mythology, and the line between those two categories is not always clearly drawn. The weather is clearly made by the creatures who govern it. The shape of the mountain was not made by the creature sleeping inside it, but the mountain's significance, its place in the region's cultural geography, is inseparable from the creature's presence. The world and the creatures in it are entangled in ways that the franchise's mythology acknowledges without fully mapping. The question of what trainers do after their journeys have concluded, after the gyms have been defeated, and the champion has been overcome, and the legendary creature has been encountered, is one that the franchise has occasionally explored through NPCs and side characters, but has never made the central focus of a story. Some trainers become gym leaders themselves, taking over the institutions that once challenged them and becoming the challenges for the next generation of travelers. Some become researchers, channeling the knowledge accumulated during their journeys into more systematic inquiry. Some simply continue to travel, their journeys never arriving at the kind of conclusion that would bring them back to something settled. The world of the franchise contains within it the accumulated histories of all of the journeys that have been taken, all of the trainers who set out from their hometowns and all of the regions depicted across all of the games, and what all of that accumulated wandering and growing and encountering looks like from outside any single journey is not something the franchise depicts. But it is present, implied by the existence of the institutions and the communities and the specific individuals that any single journey passes through, each of them carrying within them the history of their own specific passage through the world's particular form of growing up. The franchise's relationship to the concept of home is one that has been present since its earliest games, but has rarely been examined directly. The journey begins at home, the place that is left behind, and the journey's implicit arc is one of departure and return. But return is rarely depicted. The games end with the journey's goal achieved, the champion defeated, the legendary encountered, and the player standing in a world that has been traversed but not yet left behind. What home means after the journey, whether the place left behind at the beginning has the same quality of home after everything that happened on the way, is a question that real life poses to everyone who has been young and traveled and come back different. The franchise does not press this question, but it is present in the structure of every game, in the small house in the small town at the beginning of the world, and in the question of whether anyone who has been through what the games depict could simply return to that house and find it unchanged and sufficient. The mystery of home in the franchise is partly the mystery of all departure and return, but it is also specific to the franchise's particular version of that story, the version in which growing up takes place in a world of wonders, in which the things encountered on the way are genuinely extraordinary, and in which the ordinary life of the starting town becomes, in retrospect, the beginning of a story that has no ordinary ending. The light that filters through the canopy of certain forest routes in the franchise has a specific quality that the game's visual design has achieved differently across its history, from the simple alternating tiles of the earliest games to the rendered shadows and dappled effects of the most recent ones. In each case, the effect was trying to do the same thing, to communicate that this particular space has a specific atmosphere, that moving through this forest at this moment is different from moving through a field or a cave. The qualities of specific habitats in the franchise's world, the way that the visual and auditory design of each environment communicates something about the character of the space, is one of the more underappreciated aspects of the game's design. Players who have spent hours in a specific cave or forest carry with them a specific sensory memory of that space, a memory that is partly of the mechanics that occurred there, and partly of the particular atmosphere the space created. The mysteries associated with specific habitats are inseparable from those sensory memories, from the quality of light and sound that accompany the discovery, and the persistence of those memories across the years since the discovery was first made is evidence of how deeply the franchise's environmental design managed to create genuine sense of place rather than simply functional space. The franchise has across its history depicted a range of relationships between human beings and Pokémon that go beyond the trainer-partner relationship at the game's center. People use Pokémon for work, for transportation, for the production of goods, in ways that the games depict without making the ethics of those uses a primary concern. The milk produced by certain Pokémon is described as delicious. The silk produced by others is highly valued. The power generated by still others runs machinery. What these working relationships mean for the creatures involved, whether there is a meaningful distinction between the partnership of a trainer and their Pokémon and the labor relationship between a farmer and the creature providing resources, is a question the franchise has occasionally touched, but has never pursued with any systematic attention. The world contains both kinds of relationship, and the games present them side by side without making the ethical difference between them an explicit subject. The mystery here is not one of narrative fact, but of the franchise's moral imagination, of what it believes about the various kinds of relationship between humans and Pokémon that its world depicts. The partnerships of the journey are clearly celebrated. The labor relationships of the background world are simply present, depicted without comment, part of the texture of a world that is more complex than any single story about it can fully address. The moment of quiet that follows the ending of a Pokémon game, the moment after the credits have rolled and the world has returned to its ambient state, is one that players who have spent long hours in a specific game know well. The world is still there. The Pokémon are still in their habitats. The routes are still populated. The cities are still active. But the story that gave all of that context is over, and the world continues without the narrative that made it legible. What the world is like in that moment after the story, but before the player has decided what to do next, is a small mystery of a very specific kind. The world that contained a story now contains only itself, and what it contains is in some sense the truest version of what it has always been, a world that existed before the story and will exist after it, that uses the story as a way of being accessed but is not limited to what the story says about it. The mysteries of the franchise's world are most fully present in that post-story moment, when the narrative scaffolding has been removed and what remains is the world and the player's curiosity about what it contains, the questions that arise in that moment, the routes not yet explored, the habitats not yet visited, the creatures not yet encountered, are the living version of the franchise's deepest invitation, the invitation to keep wondering, to keep looking, to treat the end of one story as the beginning of the wondering that comes after it. What the Pokemon world has given, across all of its games and all of its generations and all of the years, it has been part of the lives of the people who found it at the right moment, is a specific quality of mystery that is patient rather than urgent, inviting rather than demanding, willing to remain open for as long as the person holding it needs it. 2. That quality is rare. It belongs to things that were made with care for the experience of the person who would encounter them, and the franchise's mysteries, for all the deliberateness with which they were placed, carry that quality with a consistency that is never diminished. The way the franchise treats the concept of legacy, the things that trainers and Pokemon and the events of each generation leave behind in the world, reflects an understanding of time that is unusual in games aimed at young people. Every generation builds on what came before it. The map expands, the mythology deepens, the roster grows, and the creatures and characters of earlier generations persist in the later ones as fixtures of a world that is genuinely continuous rather than periodically reset. This continuity is one of the things that makes the franchise's mysteries feel different from the mysteries of other game series. When a question raised in an early game is referenced in a much later one, the reference carries the weight of everything that happened between the two moments, all of the games, and years and player conversations that existed in the gap. The world remembers, and the act of returning to an old question in a new game is an acknowledgement that the question was worth keeping. The franchise itself has become a form of legacy, a record of what a specific creative community cared about across a specific span of time, and the mysteries it left open are part of that record. They are the places where the world said, "We do not know the answer to this," and that not knowing is worth preserving alongside everything else. The sound of rain in certain Pokemon games, falling across a route that was not raining when you last walked through it, the sky changed by the game's internal weather system while you were doing something else, is one of the franchise's smallest and most effective atmospheric achievements. The rain is not there because the story requires it. It is there because the world has weather, because the game decided early that a world worth spending time in is a world in which it sometimes rains without warning and sometimes clears without explanation. These incidental details, the ones that exist not to serve a narrative purpose, but simply to make the world feel inhabited by processes that continue regardless of the players' attention, are among the franchise's most enduring gifts. The mystery is not in any of them individually, but in the cumulative effect of a world that seems to keep going even when you are not looking at it, that has a quality of autonomous existence that games do not always manage to create. What makes a fictional world feel real is not realism in the strict sense, but this quality of continuation, the sense that the world has its own reasons for the way it is, arranged in its own processes that operate independently of any particular observer's presence. The Pokemon world has that quality, and the mysteries that live in it benefit from it, feel like genuine mysteries rather than design puzzles precisely because they exist in a world that seems to keep having them, whether or not anyone is there to wonder about them. The world keeps its wonders close, and the night keeps its questions open. There are places in the franchise that exist only to be beautiful, only to give the person moving through them a moment of stillness before the next route, the next encounter, the next decision. Those places are not mysteries in the conventional sense, but they hold within them the same quality of excess, of a world that gives more than the story requires, that the franchise's mysteries do. They are the world being generous with the attention of the people who find them, offering something that is not necessary, but is genuinely good. and the franchise's long history of offering that generosity, of building worlds that contain more beauty and more mystery than any single story demands, is the deepest reason that the questions it raises have been worth keeping for as long as they have been kept. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.